15 years. That's how long Daniel and Emily Carter had been married, a number that sounded strong and enduring on paper but felt fragile and worn in reality. Their marriage hadn't crumbled overnight. It had faded quietly, like the slow dimming of a once bright flame. What used to be laughter and long conversations had turned into quiet nods over dinner, empty words like, "I'm fine," and "maybe next weekend." They weren't angry at each other, just disconnected. Emily used to be a whirlwind of warmth. Daniel could still remember her smile, the one that could light up an entire room. But over the years, life had wrapped her in layers of responsibility. As a high school teacher, she spent her days nurturing other people's children, pouring her energy into lesson plans and report cards. When she came home, she was too tired to talk, too weary to laugh. Daniel, on the other hand, had once dreamed of music, writing songs, performing, maybe even recording an album one day. But practicality had won over passion. Bills needed paying, their son needed school fees, and soon his guitar gathered dust while spreadsheets took over his life. He'd become a manager at an insurance firm, sitting under fluorescent lights that hummed like broken dreams. Their love had become something familiar but distant, like an old song you still remember the lyrics to but can't feel anymore. They didn't fight. They didn't argue. They just existed beside each other, moving through the motions of life with quiet resignation. The silence between them was not heavy with tension. It was worse. It was empty. When their only son, Ryan, left for college a year ago, the house became too big, too quiet. At first, they thought it was just empty nest syndrome. But soon, the truth settled in. Ryan had been the bridge between them. With him gone, there was nothing left to distract them from the growing distance. Then came their anniversary. 15 years. A milestone that should have been celebrated with love and pride. But that morning, Emily was too busy grading papers to remember. Daniel noticed but said nothing. He'd already expected it. When she left for work, she didn't see the little box he'd hidden in his drawer, a necklace she once admired in a store window years ago. He closed the drawer, sighing quietly. What was the point? That night, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The TV flickered without meaning, showing scenes he wasn't watching. The house smelled faintly of Emily's lavender perfume, but even that felt like a ghost of what used to be. He looked around at the family photos, vacations, birthdays, moments frozen in joy, and for the first time in a long while, he realized how far they had drifted from those smiles. Then he opened an old photo album. The first page stopped him cold. It was a picture from their early days, both of them soaked in rain, laughing uncontrollably, holding ice cream cones that were melting faster than they could eat. They had gotten caught in a summer storm on their first date and decided to dance in the rain instead of running for cover. Emily's hair was sticking to her cheeks, and Daniel's arm was around her, holding her close. He remembered that night vividly, the thrill, the joy, the feeling of being alive. As he stared at the photo, something inside him stirred, not regret, but longing. A deep, aching desire to feel that again. To see her smile like that once more. He realized that they hadn't lost their love, they had just buried it under years of routine and silence. That night, Daniel made a decision. He didn't want a divorce. He didn't want counseling. He wanted something simpler, a chance to remind Emily and himself who they once were. One night. That's all it would take. One night to break the silence, to relight the spark that time had stolen, and as he closed the album, a faint smile touched his lips. He had no plan yet, no idea where to start, but deep down, Daniel knew this. It wasn't too late. Not yet. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a rare sense of purpose humming in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement, a feeling that had nothing to do with work or routine. The photo from last night still lingered in his mind, like a whisper from a younger version of himself urging him to do something. He spent the entire day at work distracted, lost in thought. While his colleagues talked about weekend plans and quarterly reports, Daniel was sketching out a different kind of plan, one that had nothing to do with spreadsheets and everything to do with love. He didn't want grand gestures or expensive gifts. Those weren't them. What he wanted was to bring her back, the Emily who once laughed so hard she snorted, who danced barefoot on kitchen tiles, who believed every sunset was a small miracle. By the time he got home, his mind was set. He rummaged through the attic until he found an old box filled with forgotten pieces of their life, concert tickets, postcards, a scratched CD labeled Our Songs. Beneath it, tucked in yellowed paper, was a small photograph of their first road trip together. They were sitting on the hood of their car, eating sandwiches and watching the sky turn orange. That was the moment, he decided. That's what he wanted to recreate. He pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote a short note in his uneven handwriting. No phones tonight. Dress warm. Meet me outside at 7. D. Then he slipped it into an envelope and placed it on Emily's pillow, along with a single sunflower, her favorite flower, though he hadn't seen her buy one in years. When Emily came home, she looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her shoulders drooped with exhaustion, and the faint lines around her eyes spoke of years of stress. She didn't notice the note at first, not until after her shower, when she was about to collapse into bed. When she saw it, her brow furrowed in confusion. Dress warm? No phones? She hesitated, wondering if it was some forgotten family event or a joke. But when she opened the envelope and saw Daniel's handwriting, the same handwriting that had once written her love letters in college, a small smile tugged at her lips. It had been a long time since he'd done something spontaneous. At exactly 7, she stepped outside. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Daniel was waiting by the car, their old beaten-up silver sedan that hadn't been driven much since Ryan left for college. He was leaning against it, holding 2 travel mugs of cocoa and wearing that boyish grin she hadn't seen in ages. "Hey," he said simply. "You ready?" Emily crossed her arms, pretending to be skeptical, though the warmth in her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "Ready for what?" "A night off," he replied. "From everything." He opened the passenger door for her, something he hadn't done in years, and as she slid in, she noticed the CD player already loaded with their songs. The car smelled faintly of cinnamon and nostalgia. They drove aimlessly through winding country roads, windows rolled down, the wind tangling Emily's hair. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by open fields and starlit skies. Daniel played songs they hadn't heard in years, soft rock, old ballads, and one tune that made them both laugh, the cheesy pop hit they danced to at their wedding. At first, their conversation was small, light jokes, old memories. But as the miles passed, something began to shift. They talked more freely, remembering the early days, the long walks, the broken-down car that led to their first kiss, the cheap roadside diners where they dreamed about the future. The awkwardness that had shadowed them for years began to melt away. With every laugh, every shared glance, the years of silence loosened their grip. For the first time in a long while, they weren't husband and wife bound by duty. They were 2 people rediscovering each other, driving nowhere and everywhere at once. When Emily rested her head against the window and softly said, "I'd forgotten what this felt like," Daniel smiled. "Then let's remember." They didn't know where the road was taking them, but for the first time in 15 years, that didn't matter. All that mattered was that they were finally moving together again. The night air grew cooler as Daniel drove farther away from the city, and the roads narrowed into familiar country lanes. Emily leaned back in her seat, watching the landscape blur into shades of silver and blue. There was something soothing about the hum of the tires and the faint music playing from the old CD, the same playlist they'd once made together. Years ago, when every song carried a memory. Do you remember this one? Daniel asked softly as a slow tune filled the car. Emily smiled faintly. Of course. You played it nonstop the week you proposed. He laughed. Because I was trying to work up the courage. She turned her head toward him, eyes glinting in the dim light. You didn't look nervous. Oh, I was terrified, he admitted. You just said yes too fast for me to faint. Their laughter lingered in the car, warm and familiar. It had been so long since they had laughed like that, not politely. Not out of obligation, but with genuine affection. The road curved toward the woods. And Emily frowned slightly as recognition flickered in her eyes. Wait, she said slowly. You're not taking us to Daniel smiled but said nothing. A few minutes later, the trees opened up. And there it was, Willow Lake, the same lake where Daniel had proposed 17 years ago. The moon hung low over the still water, casting a trail of silver across its surface. The old wooden pier was still there, weathered but standing, creaking softly with the breeze. Emily's breath caught. I can't believe this place is still here. Daniel parked the car and got out, walking around to open her door. He extended his hand. Come on. Let's see if the lake remembers us. Emily hesitated for a moment, then slipped her hand into his. His fingers were warm and firm, the grip reassuring. As they stepped onto the pier, the wood groaned beneath them just as it had all those years ago. I remember you dropped the ring, Emily said, smiling at the memory. Daniel groaned. Don't remind me. I almost dove in after it. You did dive in after it, she corrected, laughing, and came out with a fish instead. He laughed with her, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe it's still down there, waiting for us. They sat down at the end of the pier, their legs dangling above the dark water. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the quiet lapping of waves and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The world felt far away, no deadlines, no bills, no empty house echoing with silence. Just the two of them, the same as before. Daniel glanced at Emily. The moonlight touched her face gently, softening the tiredness that had settled there over the years. For a moment, he saw her as he used to, bright-eyed, full of laughter, full of life. And he realized how much he'd missed that version of her, and how much he'd missed them. Without a word, he stood up and held out his hand again. Dance with me, he said quietly. Emily blinked, surprised. Here? Right here, he said with a grin. We used to dance everywhere. She shook her head, laughing softly. There's no music. There doesn't need to be. He took her hand, pulling her gently to her feet. Slowly, awkwardly at first, they began to sway, their movements clumsy but full of meaning. The soft wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint rhythm of crickets, and for a moment it was enough. Emily rested her head against his shoulder, and Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of memories, unspoken apologies, and rediscovered warmth. As the night deepened, they sat together again, talking about everything and nothing, their dreams, their fears, the things they never said. Emily confessed how she'd missed him even while sitting beside him. Daniel admitted how he'd buried his feelings under work because he didn't know how to fix what was broken. By the time the moon began to dip behind the trees, they had laughed, cried, and fallen into a silence that felt safe again. For a few hours, the years between them dissolved. There were no responsibilities, no regrets, only two people sitting by a lake, remembering how it felt to love freely. When they finally stood to leave, Daniel squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "I think we found it again." Emily smiled through the tears shining in her eyes. "We never lost it," she said softly. "We just forgot where to look." The night at Willow Lake had wrapped Daniel and Emily in a quiet kind of magic, the kind that doesn't shout or sparkle, but hums softly in the background, steady and comforting. They had danced, laughed, and for the first time in years, looked at each other not as weary partners sharing a house, but as two souls rediscovering their rhythm. But as the laughter faded and the stars deepened above them, silence settled again, not the distant kind they'd grown used to, but something heavier, waiting. Emily sat cross-legged on the blanket they'd spread near the car, hugging her knees, watching the ripples shimmer across the lake. Daniel sat beside her, fingers loosely holding a stone he kept tossing and catching. He looked calm, but his heart was racing. There were things he'd buried for too long, thoughts he never voiced, fears he never dared to speak. And now, under that soft moonlight, they were pressing against his chest, demanding to be freed. Finally, he spoke. "You know," he said quietly, "there were times I thought we wouldn't make it." Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" He let out a slow breath. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, we stopped being us. You were busy with work, I was buried in mine, and every night we came home, sat at the same table, and acted like strangers." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought maybe you didn't need me anymore." Emily's eyes softened, but her lips trembled. "Daniel." He turned toward her, his voice low and rough. "I used to lie awake at night wondering what I did wrong, wondering when your smile stopped agieing for me. I thought maybe you regretted choosing this life, choosing me." The words hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Emily's breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. For years they had walked around these truths, pretending everything was fine. Hearing it out loud felt both painful and freeing. "Daniel," she whispered, "I thought you stopped seeing me." He blinked, surprised. "I thought you'd fallen out of love," she continued, her voice trembling. "You used to look at me like I was the only thing that mattered. But then you got quieter. You'd come home tired, barely say a word, and I didn't know how to reach you. I kept trying to fix things, to fill the silence, but you seemed so far away. I started thinking maybe you stayed for Ryan, not for me." Daniel shook his head, his throat tight. "Emily, no. That was never true." She looked down, wiping a tear. "I guess I stopped trying after a while. I thought maybe if I just kept busy, I wouldn't have to feel it. The emptiness." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing her skin gently. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of saying the wrong thing. Scared that maybe you didn't love me the same way anymore." Emily let out a shaky laugh, one mixed with tears. "We were both scared. Of losing something we already thought we'd lost." They sat there, their hands entwined, the truth between them no longer something to hide. For years, their silence had built walls, brick by brick, not out of anger, but fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of indifference. And now, piece by piece, those walls were falling. Daniel turned to her, eyes glistening. "I missed you, Em. God, I missed you. Not just being around you. I missed your laugh, your voice, the way you'd sing off-key just to annoy me. I missed us." Emily smiled through her tears, her voice soft and full of ache. "Then let's stop missing us." He laughed quietly, a sound filled with relief and emotion. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't want to lose you again." "You won't," she whispered. "Not if we keep finding our way back." The confession didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years of distance or the quiet pain of growing apart. But it was a start, a raw, honest beginning. For the first time, they had spoken not as two people pretending everything was fine, but as two hearts finally telling the truth. As the wind swept gently across the lake, carrying away the echoes of their words, Daniel squeezed her hand. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, the kind of silence shared by two people who finally understood each other again. And for the first time in a very long while, both Daniel and Emily felt something they hadn't felt in years: hope. The first light of dawn crept gently over Willow Lake, painting the surface in hues of gold and rose. The chill of the night was fading, replaced by a soft warmth that carried the promise of a new beginning. Daniel and Emily sat side by side on the blanket, their shoulders touching, both silent yet peaceful. After all the words and tears that had spilled between them, silence no longer felt like distance, it felt like rest. Emily leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, her eyes half closed as she watched the sun climb higher. "I forgot how beautiful mornings are here," she murmured. Daniel smiled, his voice low and content. "You used to say the sunrise made you feel alive." She chuckled softly. "I used to say a lot of things." He turned to look at her, his gaze tender. "You still do. You just stopped saying them out loud." Her lips curved into a faint, shy smile, one he hadn't seen in years. The air around them was quiet except for the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant song of birds waking to the morning. Everything about that moment felt fragile and sacred, like the first breath after being underwater for too long. When they finally stood to leave, the world seemed lighter somehow. The drive back was quiet, but it wasn't the same strained quiet of the past. Emily rested her hand on the window frame, watching the trees roll by, and every now and then she caught Daniel glancing at her. Neither said anything about it, but the faint blush that rose on her cheek said enough. Halfway home, Daniel took a detour. Emily frowned. "This isn't the way." He just smiled. "Trust me." Minutes later, he pulled into a small roadside diner, Maggie's Place. The faded sign and neon lights were instantly familiar. Emily blinked in surprise. "Daniel Carter, you're not serious." He grinned. "Oh, I'm very serious. Best terrible coffee in the entire county." She laughed, a real laugh this time, and it filled the car with a warmth that made Daniel's chest tighten. They stepped inside, greeted by the smell of frying bacon and nostalgia. The same red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the same old waitress, Maggie herself, still stood behind the counter. Older but just as sharp-eyed. Double quotes, "Well, if it isn't the Carters," she said with a grin. "Haven't seen you two lovebirds in years." Emily felt her cheeks warm. Daniel chuckled. "Guess we're overdue for a refill." They took their old booth by the window. The seat creaked under them, the table was still slightly crooked, and the coffee tasted just as bad as ever, but none of it mattered. It wasn't the diner that made the moment special. It was them. For a while, they talked like they used to, about silly things. About the past, about nothing important but everything meaningful. Emily teased him for still over-sugaring his coffee. Daniel teased her for ordering pancakes she never finished. They laughed so much that Maggie came over twice just to tell them to keep it down. And in that laughter, something unspoken shifted. Emily reached across the table, brushing her fingers against Daniel's hand. It was a small gesture, almost hesitant, but the moment their skin touched, a warmth spread through them both. Daniel's hand turned over to hold hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, effortlessly. It wasn't planned. It wasn't forced. It just happened. For the first time in years, their hands fit together the way they always had, like they were meant to. When they finally left the diner, the sky was bright and alive with daylight. As they walked toward the car, Emily stopped him, pulling him gently by his sleeve. He turned, and before he could say anything, she kissed him. It wasn't a desperate kiss or one born of nostalgia. It was quiet, deep, real. The kind of kiss that says, "I still choose you." When they pulled apart, she whispered, "Thank you for last night." Daniel smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she said, eyes shimmering. "You reminded me of who we were, and who we can still be." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb tracing her cheek. "Then let's not forget again." As they drove home, the world seemed brighter, the music sweeter. For the first time in 15 years, Emily found herself humming along to the radio, and Daniel, without realizing it, joined in. Their voices weren't perfect, but together, they were in tune. The spark that had dimmed for years wasn't just reignited, it was glowing stronger than ever. And this time, they both knew it wasn't by chance. It was by choice. The week after their night at Willow Lake felt different, subtly, quietly different. Nothing dramatic had changed in Daniel and Emily's world. The same work emails arrived every morning, the same chores waited at home, and the same city hummed outside their window. But they had changed. The air between them wasn't filled with avoidance anymore, it carried laughter, small touches, and an awareness that something precious had been rediscovered. Every morning, Daniel found himself waking up a little earlier just to brew coffee for both of them the way he used to. Emily would come into the kitchen, still sleepy, but smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes. They'd share quiet breakfasts, talking about small, silly things, her students, his coworkers, weekend plans. The kind of conversations they used to have when love was new and easy. That Saturday, Daniel called her into the attic. "I've got something to show you," he said, eyes twinkling with the same mischief that once made her fall in love with him. Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. The attic door creaked as they climbed up, and she immediately noticed the change. The space that used to be cluttered with old boxes and forgotten furniture had been transformed. A soft rug covered the floor, fairy lights hung across the beams, and two instruments sat side by side, an old acoustic guitar and a small upright piano. For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Daniel, you didn't." He grinned sheepishly. "I figured it was time to bring back what we loved. You always said music made us." She walked slowly to the piano, running her fingers over the keys. Dusty, slightly out of tune, but beautiful. "You remembered," she whispered. "Of course I did," he said gently. "You used to play every Sunday morning until Rain complained about the noise." She laughed, tears welling in her eyes. "I haven't played in years." "Then tonight," Daniel said, setting the guitar on his knee, "we start again." That evening, they sat side by side, fumbling through chords and melodies. Their fingers were stiff, their timing imperfect, but it didn't matter. They sang softly, laughed at their mistakes, and lost themselves in memories that felt brand new again. The attic filled with music, uneven, raw, but full of warmth. It was as if the walls themselves sighed in relief, welcoming back something they'd missed for years. After a while, Emily leaned back, smiling. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Daniel nodded. "We are. Every Friday night, no work, no phones, no distractions. Just us." She looked at him for a long time, her heart swelling. This wasn't the young man she'd married. He had lines around his eyes now, gray strands in his hair, and a calmer voice. But in that moment, she realized she loved this version of him even more. They had weathered storms, endured silences, lost their way, and still, somehow, found their path back to each other. Over the next few weeks, their Friday nights became sacred. They cooked dinner together, lit candles, and filled the house with music and laughter. Sometimes they'd dance in the living room. Other times, they'd sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, talking about dreams they still wanted to chase. Daniel even started writing songs again, simple, heartfelt ones. One evening, he played her a new melody and said quietly, "It's called 15 Years." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "What's it about?" He smiled. "About two people who thought time stole their love, but found out it was only hiding." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then let's never hide again." And they didn't. From that point on, love for them wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was in the morning coffee he made for her, the post-it notes she left on his desk, the quiet dinners where laughter flowed easily, the little habits that built a life stronger, wiser, and more tender than before. That one night by the lake hadn't just made them feel young again. It had reminded them that love, real love, isn't about chasing what was lost. It's about choosing each other over and over. Even after all the years died, as the music drifted softly through their home that night, Emily leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder and whispered, "You know, I think we're better now than we've ever been." Daniel smiled, his voice warm and certain. "That's because now we know what it means to stay." And as the lights glowed around them, two hearts, once dulled by time, beat in perfect harmony again.